Excellence on Africa. It's now time for our interview segment. And this week we're discussing UN at 79, the journey so far. Now, the United Nations was founded on October 24th, 1945, after World War II, to promote peace, security, and cooperation. The United Nations has made significant strides in its inception 79 years ago, and that's what we're discussing today. How far, so far. And I have two guests with me. I have a guest via Zoom. He is Associate Professor Eugene Obiora. Eugene, a professor of military history, security, defense, and strategy. Associate Professor Eugene, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, and I also have a studio guest with me. Her name is Asmau Benzis Leo. She's an expert on international affairs, gender, and conflict. Madam, you're also welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
All right, so we're discussing UN, like I said, the journey, at UN at 79, the journey so far. And I'd like to ask you very quickly, what do you consider to be the major achievements in the United Nations history over the past 79 years?
Thank you very much. And also, once again, good day, viewer. The United Nations, you rightly said, was established in 1945. So it's been 79 years gone by. And we must applaud many of the successes of the United Nations, and not also forgetting that the United Nations also has its own challenges, especially in the contemporary period we found ourselves. Looking at the historical trajectory of the United Nations from the formative age to this level, basically it was established for the international peace and securing international peace and security, also promoting human rights and then the sovereignty of nations, also other issues that pertain to the relationships, diplomatic relationship with the member states of the United Nations. And so far we have seen that in terms of international peace and security, yes, some people will say the United Nations has not achieved anything, but for me, I can say the United Nations has achieved not everything that is meant to be achieved, but they've made tremendous progress and they're still doing their best. The challenges the UN is facing at the moment is they are multifaceted and multidimensional challenges they are facing. And one has to do with the legal framework establishing the UN, and also the aspect of the permanent and the veto power that has been assigned to especially the UN Security Council themselves. So if there are challenges, especially the use of veto power, you know, international peace and security, whenever there is going to be any intervention by the UN member state, especially at the headquarters, you will discover that it has to go through the UN Security Council, and they have to give their approval for any multilateral intervention. But because most at times, some of the members in the United Nations Security Council are also culpable of such offense, you see that they use the veto power to undermine the entire work of the United Nations. So we cannot say that the entire United Nations has not succeeded. It has succeeded, but then we have to look critically on the use of veto power and the five permanent members of the United Nations. How do we reform the use of veto power so that international peace and security will be achieved?
All right, thank you very much. And I'd like to come to our Zoom guest now. Associate Professor Eugene, are you still with me?
Yes, I am.
The UN Charter in Chapter 1 talks about the organization's purposes and principles. Now, to what extent do you believe these purposes and principles have been achieved?
Thank you very much, moderator. I think for us to understand what is going on in the UN, we have to have a retrospective view of how the international body came into being. This is an organization formed by the victorious powers after the Second World War. They wrote the charter in San Francisco, USA, and arrogated to themselves the self-arrogating right of veto, which means they have the ultimate authority to condemn, or if you like, to nullify any decision taken by the UN General Assembly. I think this has had a very negative impact on the positive influence of the World Body. Why I say this is that we have about 194 member states of the United Nations, and only 5 members reserve the right, collectively or individually, to nullify any decision by the UN. Because the United Nations Charter has a recommending General Assembly and a deciding Security Council. The General Assembly can vote on any issue, but for decisions to be taken and effected, it must be approved by the Security Council. So this is the problem, and this has been the problematic haunting the United Nations. The UN has achieved to a very large extent its goal of maintaining international security and peace, but with restrictions and limitations. This is because there's no democratic principle, or if you like, process that goes on in the UN. Somebody referred to it as a dictatorship of the P5, which makes a lot of sense. So as long as their interest is protected, then they don't have problem. Well, but once their interest collectively or individually is threatened, they can veto any issue, even if it's to the benefit of other members, majority members of the United Nations. And this has affected some of the activities of the UN and its agencies. That is my point for now.
I'd like to still stay with you. Now, the world has seen more conflicts than before. You know, we're talking about Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Palestine, Iran war, China versus its neighbors on sea issues. Now, how is the UN addressing these conflicts?
The UN is handicapped because it is difficult to really conceptualize and identify what the UN is. Is it a sovereign organization? The answer is no. It is an experiment in global governance. And there is no sovereign head of state of the UN. The UN itself is not a sovereign organization, but sovereign member states are members. So it's just an association of sovereign member states. And each sovereign member state, because of its sovereignty, is the ultimate authority below no other authority. And because of that, there is a problem, because at the national level, the president or prime minister is the sovereign, or even the king or queen. But at the experiment in global governance, nobody is there at the apex to impose sanctions or dictate what happens when somebody violates the laws of the UN. And this is why the element of sovereignty has limited to a very large extent the capability of the UN to execute its functions creditably. Because when he wants to do that, if the interest of any, especially the big powers, member states, is affected, they will veto it. It will be vetoed. And the objective of the UN will not be achieved. There is conflict in Ukraine. There is conflict in Gaza, in Lebanon, between Iran and Israel. All these things prove to a large extent the anarchical nature of the international system. Because as long as nation states reserve and try to protect their sovereignty, there is nothing you can do. Because you cannot dictate to any nation, no matter how big or small, how it will behave. The nation will tell you that it is sovereign and it doesn't take orders from anybody. At the General Assembly, okay, where everybody is equal. But once you leave there and go to Security Council, there's a problem. So when we have conflicts today, is because the attempt to have the United Nations and have an experiment in global governance has been weakened so much by the tendency of some sovereigns, and by sovereigns I mean heads of state, heads of government, take decisions. They wake up any morning and go and how do I put it? Violate UN Charter, or they can even violate human rights. Nothing. Who will sanction them? Nobody sanctions them, and that is why some nations feel that they should take decisions in their national interest, because there's no consensual arrangement by which all nation states can agree that this issue or that issue is to the interest of the generality of the UN member states. Therefore, based on their sovereign consciousness, they take decision and feel that nobody can decide for them. Russia can invade Ukraine. Iran and Israel can take any decision to commence hostilities. Who is going to stop them? But it is within nations, in national government. The president or prime minister can take a decision that this is what they are going to do. Who is going to do that in the UN? And the worst case scenario is that member states of the P5 are not working in tandem with the UNDC. They are disparate. They don't have a consensual opinion. Some of them are even enemies. Today, America is not in good terms with Russia and China and North Korea. So based on that, how do you have an order in the international system? So I think the international system is an organized anarchical system, but it's organized. That's the point I want to make. It's organized, but it's anarchical to a large extent.
Now, picking up on what he said about the UN General Assembly, where there's always an opportunity, for members to call for the reform of the UN Security Council. Now, what changes do you believe are relevant and why?
We just had in the last UNGA, just last month, September, October, the UN General Assembly came together and to form this aspect, what they call the Summit of the Future. And the emphasis on the Summit of the Future is basically to reform the entire UN system. So looking at the aspect like climate change, international peace and security, other aspect on scientific discovery, the use of AI in the modern day, especially in conflict prevention and peace building. So a lot of emerging issues that came up that the UN and member states with the input from civil society organizations across the world came together and organized the Summit of the Future. And the Summit of the Future is for member states to have a retrospective focus into how the UN system should be after 79 years, moving forward. How do they expect the UN to be? And most of the conversation that took place, fortunately, I was there. I attended the Summit of the Future for the entire period. And it was a transgenerational and intergenerational dialogue whereby young people were brought together with the old generation of people to decide the next phase of life. There are many things threatening humanity beside the aspect of war taking place. There are other emerging issues. Climate issue is there. The use of AI in conventional wars now, the non-conventional wars rather, and a lot of things that are coming up that if we are not careful, there will be no sustainable development for the coming generation. And basically, people were looking at, okay, Prof has rightly mentioned the use of veto power. Yeah, veto power, sometimes it was brought about because they thought if another nation, they were trying to discourage the aspect of unilateralism, whereby a singular country like they used to do before the emergence of the UN can go and occupy another sovereign nation. So they felt if there has to be any form of military intervention, it has to be multilaterally. But we are seeing that the aim of that usage, the aim of having the veto power by the 5 key UN Security Council members have been bastardized for personal interest. And so therefore there has to be a total overhaul of the UN system. Right now, when we were there, Africa was crying foul that Africa wants to have also a representation at the UN Security Council, the permanent members. Asian Pacific is also crying, Latin America, they are saying that it is not inclusive. And so the perspective and other concerns of other member states is not being captured because it's like a Western concept. because all the members of the UN Security Council are Western nations. So you can see that there has to be a deliberate effort. And this time around, it's not just for few countries in the world to sit down and decide the future of the entire world. We know that there are 194 members. So how can 5 nations determine the destinies of over 89 member states? It is unfair and it is unacceptable. That is why I think from the outcome of the Summit of the Future, by next year, we intend to see a better, more robust, and a proactive United Nations.
Right. So how do you think they can improve their efficiency?
Efficiency, there are many ways. The UN does not have money to fund itself. It depends on member states' contribution to function. And so if they depend on those member states, whoever brings more of the money controls what decision is taken at the UN system, at the UN itself. And looking at the issue of peacekeeping, because you bring about, they don't have a standing force that this is UN peacekeepers. What they do is troop contributing countries bring their military personnel and form what they call the UN peacekeeping force. And as long as member states are the ones doing these things, of course, he that plays the piper, they take the tune. And at the end of the day, it is about interest. Sovereignty, of course, a member state, like he rightly said, member state will tell you that, no, we are sovereign nation and we will not allow the UN to dictate to us what to do. And so therefore they safeguard that sovereignty, or they perpetrate violation on the rights of others under the cover of sovereignty. So a lot of politics is going on in the international system, of which I think the UN does not even have the capacity at the moment truly to do that. So member states have to have what we call intentional and sincere and political will to drive this process to ensure that the UN system becomes inclusive, the UN system becomes a system whereby every member state can have a say within the international governance system.
Very true, very true. Prof, I'd like to ask you now, how do you think, how is the UN tackling climate change, and what are the obstacles affecting the implications of sustainable solutions?
A system is a whole that functions as a whole by virtue of its interdependent component parts. The United Nations is a system. And for us to know how the climate change issue is being addressed by the UN, just like other issues that are not climate change, we have to understand the structure of the United Nations. And what one United Nations Secretary General, late Dag Hammarskjöld, said when he stated that the UN was founded, or is founded, not on the principle of taking humanity, not on the idealism of taking humanity to heaven, but on the reality of saving it from hell. I'm quoting Dag Hammarskjöld. What this means is that the UN system has its basic structural handicaps, because the climate issue we are talking of is the emission of greenhouse gases that are altering the climate matrix. But you discover that some of these developed nations are competing on who should reduce emission and who should not reduce. You discover that each nation, China has a different opinion from the US. US has a different opinion from Russia about gas emission, CO2 emission, greenhouse gases, because they are considering their economic and national interest. A situation where there is no consensus between these big powers, big emitters, India, China, US, Russia. These are the major emitters, not even Nigeria, my country. So once they don't have consensual opinion, and they don't even relate well to a large extent, especially between America and the Russians, America and China. Today, China is competing with America in in terms of economic status, who is going to be the largest economic power in the world. And China feels that if it follows the template of American greenhouse policies, it will lose out. America feels that it is watching China to know the way it goes. If they discover that China is not keeping to the rules on global climate change and rules to guide emissions and so on and so forth, it will consider its own interest. So we end up in a situation where countries consider themselves first and they don't talk about the globe. Even though the United Nations, which they are members, constitute an experiment in global governance. But they know there is no sanction. And if there is sanction, nobody will effect it. And they will go scot-free. That is where we find ourselves where we are today.
All right. How do you think the UN can be more effective in promoting and protecting human rights?
In terms of human rights, it's all part of the whole engagement of the UN because it's part of its mandate to make sure that the rights of every citizen on earth and a citizen of any member state UN is protected. But the issue is if the policy of the UN on the rights of citizens of nation states is trying to interfere, and I'm going to give you an example with China, which the West is accusing of violating the rights of opposition members to the government, and in some cases, where you have the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, the West, America in particular, Britain, Germany, and others, they've been criticizing China for that, but China is not interested. Because it knows that nobody is going to sanction it. You understand? Nobody is going to sanction it. So it regards itself based on its sovereign attribute that no country on earth can determine for it what it's going to do. And that as far as it's concerned, the way he's handling the Uyghur issues in China and the opposition in China, and then the right of individuals accused of treasonable acts against the state. Sometimes they are even executed before the world knows it.
All right,
for crimes that you can go to prison in the West. So these are the discrepancies in the perception of human rights. The perception is different in the West and is different in the East.
All right, thank you,
Prof.
Prof.
No consensus meeting point. This is the problem.
All right, thank you, Prof. We're running out of time. And
this is a very big problem for the UN. Yes.
Thank you very much, Prof. So, you know, to wrap it up right now, let's bring it back home. What do you think is Africa's role, or what role do you think Africa can play in shaping UN's global agenda?
The African Union has to work collaboratively with the United Nations. Member states of the African Union sometimes take a kind of layback position when it comes to international diplomacy. Africa has to stand on its feet. Africa has to be a voice at the United Nations. Not just Africa should just sit back and watch other Western countries determine to Africa what it should do. And another thing is also the issue of aid dependency, because Africa depends so much on aid from the Western countries. So whenever decisions are taken, they feel, oh, we wouldn't want to be in a form of confrontation with people that support us in terms of monetary values. Especially some of those international organizations that provide aid, grant, loans to African countries. Africa should be self-sustaining. Africa should look inward and look at the resources, God-given resources, both natural and also man-made and human resources that they can tap into. The world is going digital. There's innovation going on, young people, entrepreneurship. Africa should develop the human capacity of our people. By the time we do that, we will stand at par with the Western world. And if we are able to stand at par with them, there is no need for any African nation to feel inferior to the West. And so if we are not inferior and we have that capacity to stand and provide for our people, then we can have a say at the UN. And another aspect is also the aspect of leadership. Africa does not have or does not portray good leadership to the international community, because we look at the crop of leaders that Africa produces. They are leaders, most of them without credibility, leaders that do not have the heart to govern the people. And so if there are no human rights protection, no provision of basic needs of your people, then what will you be going to the UN and be saying? There is every year they take record of countries' progress. So what is the progress of African countries? Until we get to that level, then we are not ready to compete in the international community.
Very aptly put. I've been speaking with my studio guest, Asma Obenzis Leo, who holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology and a master's degree in conflict management and peace studies. And also my Zoom guest, Associate Professor Eugene Obiora Eugene, a lecturer at the Department of History and War Studies, Nigerian Defense Academy, Kaduna. It's been very insightful talking with both of you. Thank you for coming on the program. We hope to do this another time, hopefully.
Thank you, madam.